Shalom and welcome to the Jewish Geography Podcast. I'm your host, Rabbi Eitan Levi. Today we're going to talk about doubt, suffering, and the problem of evil. I know that sounds heavy, but please stick with me. I promise to end it on a high note. Now on with the show. Judaism assumes that an all-powerful God created the world. If you follow the line of reasoning of the classic Jewish thinkers on this subject, such as the Ramchal, this is because God is good. And as the ultimate good, he wanted to bestow goodness on others, for which he had to create others, and that's us. But to simply give a gift is nothing compared to allowing someone to earn it. So he gave us free will and allowed us to decide to be good or not. The bad in the world is part of this arrangement. The situations of difficulty, the bad things people choose to do, are the results of allowing us to choose, to have autonomy, to be something greater and more meaningful than robots, which is essentially what we would be if we didn't have free will. And that's all well and good in the abstract, but when you're suffering, as most of us do from time to time, and some of us do most or all of the time, this is pretty cold comfort. So you might ask why God created the world with those rules, right? Why did God create the universe with these traits that choosing something is more valuable than having it granted as a gift? Why does he allow the free will choices of one person to harm other people? Ultimately, we don't have any answer to those questions. Any reason we come up with just becomes one more layer, one more turtle piled on top of the others on which the world rests, right? Now, when I first became religious, I was a philosophy student in college, and I convinced myself that my choice was entirely rational. That A flowed logically to B, B to C, C to God, and from God to Torah, and Torah to an observant life. In my old age, now 32, I've softened on that and realized that there is really no proof of God's existence. There is no infallible argument that gets one from A to God with no doubt. And that's why I'm not big on philosophical proofs of God's existence. One of the attempts at these that I appreciate is Lawrence Kellerman's Permission to Believe. I like it because he explicitly says in the introduction that these are not proofs. They are arguments. So what's the difference? It's a little bit technical. A proof proves something for sure, right? 2 + 2 is 4. That's like a mathematical proof. It just is true. On the other hand, an argument is I'm giving you reasons why this makes sense, reasons why this might be true, but it's not true in the same way that 2 + 2 = 4 is true. Now, there are arguments in Permission to Believe that put together can get a person who wants to believe to a point where that belief seems reasonable. It can get him or her to the precipice from which he must make a leap of faith. When I look back on my own story now, I see something along those lines. Arguments and logic interspersed with logical leaps and leaps of faith. And then, once you're inside, once you've enveloped yourself with faith, God becomes an experience rather than an idea. God becomes a reality that defines you, encompasses you, relates to you, loves you. And that experience becomes certainty for many. But for me, I always try to keep in mind the process that brought me here. And I try to maintain some humility in the knowledge that, however much I don't think this is the case, I could be wrong. And when I'm suffering, what do I tell myself? Well, for one thing, suffering itself doesn't really challenge my faith in any way, so I just want to put that to rest. When I became religious, I already knew about the Holocaust, about sex trafficking, medieval tortures, and other similarly grim crimes and suffering throughout human history and throughout the world today. So either God holds up under that or he doesn't, and that shouldn't change. There's no reason that should change when the bad thing happens to me. I decided that he did hold up under that. So compared to all those horrible things, my worst personal suffering is pretty insignificant. Even if it's the worst suffering possible, I'm only one person. So why am I having this suffering? I mentioned in a past episode the depression that I suffer from occasionally. I didn't mention that I have a few medical problems that interact with that, including a significant amount of chronic pain. That is just pain that I have most of the time as I go through life. I manage it, I make it less, minimize it, choose not to focus on it sometimes, and other times it overwhelms me. I think a lot of people walk around with this sort of pain, and I've never really spoken about it at length on the podcast because honestly I think it's kind of boring. Now, my wise friend Shimon, a fellow former Denverite, once put it this way, not about suffering in particular, but about the way God interacts with our lives. He said that your life is like a movie God is putting on especially for you. Everything that happens is curated by an infinite intelligence to give you the challenge you need, to give you an opportunity. So when I'm suffering with my individual, what I would call first world problems, I can easily believe that, and it brings me comfort. God chose me for this extraordinary suffering. I wouldn't have chosen it for myself, but God must have a lot of faith in me to give me such a test, and to have faith that I will be able to pass it. But then, when I think about horrible crimes like the Holocaust or other occasions when huge numbers of blameless souls have been murdered, I wonder, what could they all have had in common that they all needed to screen the same movie? In Judaism, we have an answer for how a just God can allow bad things to happen to good people. We say that the reward and punishment in the afterlife will even those things out, so everybody gets what they deserve in the end. And when we're talking about God allowing human beings to have free will, and the negative experiences can be explained by that, then in that case, this explanation is enough. But if I believe that God is personally curating our entire lives, how do I deal with these large-scale tragedies? Again, like the Asian tsunami, the Holocaust, the Great Starvation in China under Mao, the massacres of Pol Pot, the incineration of innocents along with everybody else in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What could all those people in those places possibly need to see the same movie for? For me, I step back and look at the world in at least two layers. There's the human scale, interpersonal reality we all live in day to day. In that scale of events, God is giving each of us a private screening. If we're meant to live, we will. If we're meant to die, the bullet will get to us somehow or other. My personal suffering is here for a reason, and it's not necessarily an issue of deserving it in the sense of simple reward and punishment. God doesn't give us what we deserve in this world. He loves us too much for that. Just like we don't necessarily always give our children what they deserve, or at least what they think they deserve. He gives us what we need in an ultimate spiritual, eternal sense of need. And then I zoom out and see the historical scale. Another feature of Jewish thought is eschatology. That is, the idea that the world is moving towards something, some sort of end, the eschaton, of perfection, in our case, the Messianic age and the world to come. God is the God of history, and nothing shows that better than the continued existence of the Jewish people, despite any reasonable expectation. And when God is moving mountains, destroying nations, and building others anew, many of those personal movies can get jumbled together. On the macro level, some people are in a movie that's a little too scary for them, for others too boring, etc. Maybe God has a way to make these two layers mesh together perfectly. And maybe there are many alternate ways we can have the experiences we're meant to have. Or maybe they simply don't mesh, these sort of two scales of looking at our human interaction with the divine. And when the historical macro perspective devours individuals, we just are overtaken by a larger plot than our own, and the degree to which we're getting what we need or not will be made right in the next world. I don't claim to know, what of those answers to the problem are correct, or if perhaps something else entirely. There's a lot of maybes there. But I am grateful that I'm living on the personal scale, and you are too, because you are listening to a podcast on a fancy new piece of technology charged with electricity from the wall, downloaded over the internet, and piped into your ears as you have the leisure time to listen to this. And since you and I are living on a human scale of events, we have the luxury of thinking, why did God choose me for this suffering? Of course, we might also ask why it rarely occurs to us to ask why God chooses us for this joy, this happiness, this fulfillment. But I think that's another topic altogether. And that's why I like to do something called Happy Hour. Welcome back to Happy Hour on the Jewish Geography Podcast. I outlined quite a conundrum in the previous piece. How do the human scale interactions of human beings with God exist at the same time that massive world-shaking events swallow up individual stories into a greater plotline? Now, one way of viewing that historical plot is one in which the relevance of the individual has become bigger and bigger over time. In the distant past, whole groups of people, what we today would call nations, could simply disappear without a peep from some plague that wiped them out, and nobody would ever know about the whole group, let alone the individuals in it. Think of the countless peoples that lived and died, lives unchanging from those of their ancestors, unchanging day to day, year to year, hunting and gathering with little or no salve for their wounds, always just one step away from imminent death, and whom we know nothing about except that they existed in the abstract. Despite the apparent precariousness of the world today, the total numbers of people dying from violence in the world has been on a long downward trend for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. For more on that, see Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. You can find the link on the show notes or just Google it. And today, in addition to fewer threats to most human beings of having their individual stories swallowed up by the grand narrative of war and destruction, we have many more ways to make and tell our stories. We have ways to communicate, to interact, and to record our existence and project our thoughts into the future or around the world. The individual experience has become magnified in the human story, especially over the past 100 years, to a point now where a random Jew sitting at home in the Judean hills can send out his thoughts to people all over the world with the push of a button. Now, I believe that individual freedom only can exist in a group context. I don't advocate or think God wants some sort of ultra-individualist, anarchist landscape with isolated pods communicating through our, mechanical means, right? But maybe in the Messianic age, when all people are able to fully express their own story, in that group context, and to relate to God fully on their own merits, in this world as in the next, maybe that's what perfection looks like. Maybe when people from all over the world will come and make the temple in Jerusalem a house of prayer for all nations, we'll finally have reached a point where God can relate to us as purely and unflinchingly in this world as in the world to come. I for one, certainly hope so, and I think, Baruch Hashem, thank God, I think that we're moving in the right direction. So, did you like the happy hour section there? Do you have some good news you'd like to share here? Do you want to tell us something great about why things are better than we all think they are? Yes, so you can write to me at eitan@rabbieitan.com. That's EITAN. That's how you spell Eitan. And you can also record yourself talking and email the file to me. And just whatever voice recording app is on your phone is fine. And just email me the file. If I like it, I may read it or play it on a future episode. Thanks, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you. If you've listened to this show for a while, you may know that usually my talks are are really scripts that I'm reading. I write out essays essentially, and I'm reading them, and I try to do it in as natural a tone as possible, so it doesn't sound like I'm reading a script, but really that's what's going on. Almost word for word, what I'm saying has been written down first usually, but right now I want to talk about something off the cuff a little bit. So excuse me if it's not as smooth and comprehensive and maybe precise as the sections I do here on the podcast usually are. It's just this wasn't going to make it into this week's podcast if I had to go through the time of writing everything down. So what do I want to talk about? What I want to talk about is Mike Bickle. So Ted Cruz, as most of you I bet know, he's a Republican candidate, a candidate for the Republican nomination for the presidential race, and he's a right-wing evangelical Christian. And he was at a church meeting with a pastor named Mike Bickle. So apparently I didn't know this, and I know that most Jews don't know this, because why would we know the names and positions of various evangelical preachers in America? But apparently Mike Bickle is a great supporter of the Jewish people and of the nation of Israel in its land. And apparently he's been that way for about a couple of decades, and has caused millions of people to rally to our cause and push for Congress to support us, and made a big political difference for us. So last week there was a clip going around of Mike Bickle giving a sermon, and he was talking about a passage in Yirmiyahu that talks about punishments that are going to come to the Jewish people if we are unfaithful in keeping our side of the covenant. Now, he and I, pastor or father, no, you don't call them father, pastor, Bickle, obviously he thinks that what I should be doing as my part of the covenant is accepting Jesus. And obviously I think that's not the case. But we agree actually on one thing, which is that when you look through the broad scope of Jewish history and you look at major events, that they're not random. We, in our tradition, in the Talmud, we talk about why the first temple was destroyed, why the second temple was destroyed. And I would argue that the second temple being destroyed was actually a more traumatic event for the Jewish people even than the Holocaust. It was actually a combination of the destruction of the temple and the put down of the Bar Kokhba revolt a couple generations later, was the destruction of the Jewish nation in the land of Israel, and a massive murder of huge numbers of Jews, something comparable or maybe even more in terms of percentage than what was killed in the Holocaust. So our sages had absolutely no qualms saying that the second temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, because of baseless hatred that we had for one another. So I don't really know why some people seem to feel that we can't, at least in the abstract, talk about events that happened more recently, maybe even the 20th century, maybe even in the 1930s and 40s in Germany and other parts of Central Europe, as part of this divine plan, meaning there was clearly a reason why the Jewish people had to go through this. We were clearly not doing what we needed to do, and some sort of massive correction was required. So Mike Bickle, in his speech or his sermon, he was basically saying that the best example of this sort of thing going on that we can look and see in history is the Holocaust. I actually don't think that's the best example. I think it's the most recent and the one that stands out the most and maybe has the most impact emotionally on people. So now I'll talk about why some people think this is disturbing and how I think we can take it, how we can take it down a notch. So I understand that it's disturbing to suggest that all these people who died in the Holocaust died for a reason. I understand that, but I'm sorry, that's Jewish theology. We believe that these big events happen for a reason. Now, what was the reason? That I would not have the chutzpah to say. So obviously, a Christian pastor, for him, it's really obvious what we are doing, we the Jewish people are doing wrong, is that we're not becoming Christians. He clearly thinks that we should accept Jesus and that until we do, these things are going to keep happening to us. On the other hand, from a Jewish perspective, we have other things that we, in general, feel we need to do better on. We need to be better at keeping the commandments. We need to be kinder to each other. We need to be better stewards of the world that God gave us. We need to mekadesh et shem shamayim. We need to sanctify God's name in the world better and more actively, and we need to reach out to our brethren who are not, inside the world of Torah and mitzvot, Torah and keeping the commandments, with kindness and encourage them, to come back to the faith of their fathers. So those are all things I think we should do better. And I don't know exactly what was going wrong at the time before the Holocaust that this major catastrophe had to happen to us. Maybe it was secularism. Maybe it was creeping problems inside the religious community itself. Maybe it was things that were happening that needed to be shaken up there. Maybe it was our fighting with each other between those groups. I don't know. But if you can't take massive tragedies and things in history that happened to the Jewish people as a spur to try to do better, to try to do more, to try to improve, then I'm not really sure how we can relate to all these prophecies in the Bible at all as having any relevance to us whatsoever. So I really don't think he's that crazy to suggest this, and I certainly don't think it's anti-Semitic. I think it's a theological conundrum, and he has an answer which is a little bit different than mine, but not whole orders of magnitude different, just different on a technicality, on what the thing is that he feels we need to do differently. So why don't I think this is a problem? Well, one reason I don't think it's a problem is because he's not advocating that Christians should go out and do bad things to Jews. In fact, the opposite. He's saying that because of our special relationship with God, even if we're not fully living up to it in his eyes, we still have a special relationship with God, which Christians should be supportive of, and they should support the Jews being in the land of Israel as much as possible. So that's great, and I'm glad to have his support. But we have this sort of fear as Jews that, really it's not genuine. It's kind of really, what's his end game? And I think it's clear his end game is he wants us all to convert to Christianity. He wants us all to believe in Jesus, and he wants us all to convert, right now or later or eventually, or to bring on the end of days where the Messiah will come back and his presence will be revealed, and all sorts of crazy stuff will happen, and we'll probably either convert or die then. And you know what? Gesundheit. When we're talking about theoretical, metaphysical ideas about what the future will be, if I'm confident in my beliefs, or if, say, you're a secularist, your lack of beliefs on this subject, then really we have nothing to fear from the opinions of Mike Bickle about what the end times should look like. And as long as the focus in this world, in the here and now, without the revealed presence of God, is on a common project, on the continued existence and flourishing of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation in our land, I think we need to, keep our guard up a little bit, but this sort of degree of just outright hatred and demonization of people coming from his perspective, I think is misplaced. So I hope that we can be a little bit more charitable to our Christian supporters, and that doesn't necessarily mean I think anyone in particular should or should not support Ted Cruz as a candidate, but the reason you shouldn't, or if you don't, I don't think the reason should have anything to do with this pastor, or in general with this particular problem with evangelical Christians. I think you should make that decision based on his policies and what you think he's going to do as President of the United States. And, on that, Gesundheit, there's certainly what to talk about. That's all for this episode of Jewish Geography. If you liked it, please go to rabbieitan.com/podcast and subscribe. Write a review on iTunes, share on Facebook or other social media, or just however you can to help spread the word some other way. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you for listening. I'll be back next Tuesday with another episode. In the meantime, have a great week and take care of each other out there.